just absolutely adore. And I remember hearing her speak and then turning to my friend who turned out to be her husband. It was like, wasn't that badass? That was years and years ago, so I can't wait to hear her again. Please help me welcome Lila.
Hi, I'm Lila, I'm an alcoholic.
Hi, Lila.
Thank you so much, Dana, for asking me to speak. Dana asked me 2 weeks ago to speak, and I've been terrified ever since. I'm really happy to be here, though, and it's really amazing to have the opportunity to do service in this program. I haven't spoken and told my story in a really long time, so I don't know what's going to come out of my mouth. But first off, I would just want to say congratulations to all the date counters and to all the people celebrating this month. It's amazing. It's a miracle. Um, I'm calling right now from Sweden. I got sober in New York, but I live in Sweden now. And Zoom has been amazing to be able to reconnect with the meetings that I got sober in and sort of my foundation in AA. So, yeah, I've been sober now for about 16 years. And my story is like this. I grew up in a Korean household, and not much was talked about, right? I mean, that's, I think, what a lot of people often share about is that I came to these rooms not really knowing how to talk about anything. And what I remember just from the beginning is that I was very uncomfortable from a very young age. Like, my original memories are of discomfort, of myself being in my skin, being in the world. When I was young, I was terrified of adults. I did not know how to talk to adults. I was scared all the time. One of the things that came to mind after I got sober was I do remember being a young child and being around like 5 or 6 years old and craving alcohol. My father was in the living room. He was drinking with his buddies beer. There were like these little cans of beer, like these baby cans of Budweiser. And I remember being in the kitchen with my mom and having a temper tantrum. Like, I needed to have one of those. I don't know how I knew what was in it. I just knew that I wanted it. And my mother finally relented and gave me a sip, and I had some. And I remember that, but it only came to mind after I got sober. Um, as I was growing up, I think the thing was that yeah, I remember feeling invisible and afraid, and not really, I just not having that manual to life, like feeling all the time awkward and weird and not knowing how to confront the situations of being in the world. And when I got to be of a the other thing was that there was a lot of violence in my home. I had a dad who was a rageaholic, um, and there was just not a lot talked about. Um, my mother was, and my sister was physically abused by my dad, and I remember just growing up in fear and not really knowing when danger would strike. Um, and so by the time I was like 16 or 17 and I started to, be able to get out of the house, I remember my first experiences with getting high and getting drunk. And the first the first time I ever used anything really in terms of like drugs or drink was I had left home. I had gone to an art camp and for the summer, and someone had pot and I smoked some, and I remember I had this permanent smile like glued to my face, and I couldn't stop smiling. And it was terrifying, but it was also awesome. And I also remember my first drink. I was out in the city. I was hanging out with these kids that I had met in Washington Square Park, and someone had Dragon Stout. And I remember being in a parking lot and drinking that and feeling drunk for the first time and feeling like, wow, I know how to be here. I know how to be around people. I know how to have friends, and I know how to be in the world. And it felt like totally the answer. Um, it was such a wonderful sensation at the time. And I was hanging out with this girl who became my best friend, and it was just like we were a team. And those are my first memories of using. Um, the thing is, as time passed, I don't want to stay too long in my drinking career, but I eventually became a bartender. It became my life. I worked in the world of drinking. I worked at a drag queen bar, and I worked there for 8 years. And basically, my introduction to how to be in the world and be with other people was through using and drinking. That's how I knew how to be here and to not be afraid and to feel the sensation that I could be seen, be myself, experience love, experience how to be loved. Everything felt free to be when I drank and used. And I think after that, I just pursued it as like the goal for everything. I only knew how to be with people with drink, and so I was a bartender for many years in the city, and my life was at night. That's how where when I was awake was at night, and when I was in the world. Um, and I think what happened for me was that over time, uh, that's what my whole life became. And there were clues to me not really knowing how to function in the world uh, during that time. I remember one night where I got off of work from bartending, and there was a bottle left on the ground in my bar, and I didn't care. I just took it. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what was in the bottle, and I just ate it. Um, as long as it could take me out of myself and out of the situation, I was happy to put it in my body. And at the end of that night, where I ended up was like on the street alone, um, with a broken bottle next to me and cutting my wrists with the glass of that broken bottle. And so these nights like that, like, were clues to, like, I really didn't know how to be in the world. Um, and thing is that alcoholism is in my family. I have a sister who's also in the rooms, who's also sober now, and she was eventually she was getting sober from her own addiction, and so through her, I started to be aware of the fact that there was something called AA. And I always had this idea that I was like a functional alcoholic because I was a bartender and I was behind the bar, and I seemed to be, handling it. But then, um, I never knew where I was going to be emotionally at night. And just before I came in the rooms, what happened was I was trying to detox. I was trying to get off of everything. And I would often go back and forth from smoking pot to drinking, and smoking pot and then drinking. And then I had visited a friend down in Florida who was a fellow bartender. And a week after I visited him, and while I was in Florida, I had tried to stop drinking. And when I came back to the city, the friend that I was visiting got into a motorcycle accident and died. And I remember trying to attend his funeral. I remember trying to attend all the memorials of his life. He was such a significant person to me. I had so much love for this person. And his name was Tamai. And I remember I was in that horrible sort of alcoholic place where I couldn't feel anything, and yet I couldn't escape. I was like in between, where the drink wasn't working anymore to help me escape, and yet I couldn't actually access my own emotions to the situation. And so I remember that had happened about a year before I ended up coming into the rooms. The thing is, whenever I hear people's stories in AA, I really love the whole part of when they first come in, and the whole sort of experience and perception of what it was like to come in the beginning. And I remember my sister had told me to meet her at a meeting. It was 12th Street Workshop. And I went down there, and it was dark, and there were these Christmas lights. and people held hands, and and it was so strange. And then I had another friend who was going to Al-Anon, and she had asked me to come to a meeting with her, and I I went to this meeting, and I remember listening to people speak, and I thought, I can't believe people talk about these things. I didn't even know that it was possible to talk about these things that people were talking about in there. And while I was in this meeting, I felt like a ghost. I wasn't sure if people could actually see me and if I was even in the room. I just felt like a floating ghost. It was so crazy. Eventually, like, I was playing, I was in and out and I was in and out. And then I started to actually count days, and I started to actually say my name in the meeting. And I started to take part is what happened. It was kind of terrifying. I think the whole thing about just feeling seen and feeling like I would have to be part of something felt like a lot of pressure. But at the same time, nobody put any pressure on me. I mean, I could just sit in the back and I could just listen to stories. And that's what I came back for. I would just come to the meetings to listen to stories and to hear my own emotions being articulated by people who could actually, who were much more articulate than I was at the time. And through going to meetings regularly, I started to find myself and I started to see myself through other people. This was like 16 years ago, and I think I just want to say that, like, it's been interesting to think about speaking today, because what is really clear to me now is like all the experiences that have happened since sobriety. People often say when you come into these rooms, you have to hold on to your seat, and so much has happened in my life since I got sober, and I don't even know where to begin. But I had no idea of how big a life could be once you get sober. I think the first step was just being able to sit in a room and just not have to be or do anything. I think that allowance that is given to you when you come here to just try to practice being yourself was one of the most amazing first experiences of coming into AA. For me, in my story of sobriety, is that, like, I got a sponsor. My sponsor was like, you need to find a home group. You need to find a place where people get to know you. And that was hard for me. And I ended up choosing a meeting that was huge, because I thought no one's ever going to know me at this meeting. And I started going to this gigantic meeting, and then I thought, and then eventually, like after a year, I was the chairperson of that meeting, and I was standing in front of that meeting, and and I would be terrified in front of this meeting, and then someone would say, "Don't worry, nobody's thinking about you anyway. They're all thinking about themselves." And slowly, I got to be known, and I got to know people. And after 2 years of sobriety, I ended up getting pregnant and having a baby with someone who I met in these rooms. And, and that was really terrifying for me, because I barely knew how to take care of like a plant. And so when that all happened, I think that's when my sobriety got really deeper, was because I had this sort of gift of desperation at 2 years, where I was really like, wow, I don't know how to do this, and I don't know what I'm doing. And I had the meetings to go to and had people, and then out of the woodwork, all these people were coming up and being like, I'm a parent. I was like, what? And so it's like my sobriety has been a series of events, of new experiences and new kind of challenges in life, where I'm constantly reminded that I don't need to be alone in these experiences, and where I end up sharing about what is going on with me as honestly as possible in these rooms. And then through the grace of God and the God that you find in these rooms, you get help. You get help with people who've actually lived through life and lived through experiences sober and know how to do that. And throughout my childhood, I never knew I was alone. I never knew my family themselves were isolated. I never knew how to belong to a group or how to reach out for help. That was something that just didn't come to mind. And I've been to so many meetings and listened to so many qualifications, and so many stories are so different from mine, but the emotions and the feelings um, I always identify with. It's been really challenging. The other thing that has happened is that after like around how long did I have? I don't know, like 6 years or so, no, 7 years. I ended up moving out of the country, out of the US. And that was like another really big experience in sobriety because thank you. I had finally learned how to reach out to people and how to be part of a group of AA. And then I moved to a place where there was no English speaking AA. And I suddenly found myself to be isolated and somewhat alone in sobriety. And my sponsor now has told me about how her sponsor has told her that there are times in your life where you're going to be alone and you're not going to have people to reach out to, or you're not going to have meetings to have. And at those times, it's really important that you have a relationship to a higher power. And in these recently challenging times with things that have been going on in my life now, which has gotten so big and so amazing, I realized like how important it is to have a spiritual life in this program and how to have a connection to a higher power. And that has kind of been the thing for me recently, is this experience of making a conscious contact and the 11th step with a higher power. And going through that, I wasn't dropped down into these challenges to just not know how to deal with them. And to always sort of remember that I have a higher power with me in any situation that I'm faced with. Recently, I pursued an academic career, and this last fall I finished a PhD here, and it was one of like the worst moments of my life. I was so bottoming out on self-will and self-resources, and like I've got to do this, and the pressure and the power, and I just hit a really physically, emotionally, spiritual bottom. And I ended up getting a new sponsor, and the sponsor really kind of put in me a sense of needing to get connected to a higher power. And I'm so grateful for that. I'm so grateful for the sense of that of knowing that I'm not alone and it's not all up to me, because that whole idea of like I'm alone and I have to do this myself was basically killing me, because in the end there were times when I doubted and I felt like I wasn't enough, and then I couldn't do what was being asked of me. And in the end I completed it and I finished it, but I know that I really did it for myself and for with my higher power, and it wasn't for anybody else. And I think that's the difference that you get to learn in these rooms, is that you get to know yourself and you find ways to know about what you need, and it's not about what others are expecting of you or what other people even think. It's really about loving yourself and knowing how to be in the world with that. And so I think I'm just going to end there. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to speak at this meeting. There's so much love at this meeting, and I've always felt it every Sunday. And I think I'm just going to end it there. Thank you.